workshop. I'd like to introduce both of us first of all. I'm Sheila Selwood. I'm clerk at West Herts College, and my colleague over here is Chris Jones, and she clerks St Helens College. We both met on the clerk's level 5 qualification a few years ago now, and I don't think ever at that time we imagined that either of us would be standing here doing something like that when we were fighting our way through that qualification, but here we are. Just a brief introduction about both of us. I've been clerk at West Herts College since 2004 and in the education sector working as clerk in some capacity since 1988. We both clerk our sponsored academies through our colleges as well. I'm chair of the Eastern Region Clerks Network and co-vice chair of the National Clerks Network, as well as sitting as the co-opted clerk on the Governors Council. And I've been working with ELSIS as an associate on various things for some time, including governors' inductions and things like that. Chris has been clerk at St Helens College for 17 years, and she's worked in the college for an unbelievable 37 years. She also clerks, as I said, her college's sponsored academy, and Chris is the current vice chair of the AOC North West Clerks Network Group. So that's a little bit about us. In terms of this workshop, what we hope it's going to deliver for you is a little bit of an introduction to self-assessment, but the main purpose of it is to give you 2 case studies of how self-assessment is handled in 2 different colleges. When I say case studies, what we're not doing is standing up here and saying this is best practice. What we're saying is this is a case study of self-assessment in 2 colleges that has worked for us. And we hope from that you'll be able to get some learning outcomes, highlight some practical examples that we can share with you that might help you back in your colleges and go forward there. We'll give you some summary considerations at the end, and time allowing, because we've had a little bit of a late start, we now really do need to take questions at the end if that's okay. So if you've got any burning questions, keep them bottled and then we'll take and deal with them at the end. In terms of materials, ELSIS are very keen that we don't cut down rainforests, so we've made our materials and various bits and pieces available electronically. In terms of the West Herts materials, we now have a case study of what we've done, which will further develop and expand on what I'm going to be able to tell you today, as well as the actual strategy documents themselves, so the actual template documents that we use back in college. And they're all now published on the AOC Governance Library, so those of you who may not have seen that yet, it's fairly recent, but that will give you a sense of what we do there. And for those of you who are interested in hearing more about what Chris is going to talk to you about, then you're very welcome to email her at her address, which I believe is on there. Yes, it is. Good. If we just quickly start with this, why are we talking about self-assessment? And as clerks or as governors, you start thinking, okay, well, where does it say what we're supposed to do? Well, first of all, Schedule 4 of the Education Act of 2011 says nothing about self-assessment. It's not in our old instruments and articles, it's not in our current instruments and articles. So the next port of call is to have a look and think, right, well, what do the various codes say that apply to governance? And though it's a little bit small, it gives you a sense of where we are with this one. This is the UK Corporate Code. This is the one that I think most of you in your colleges will be signing up to on a comply or explain basis in your end-of-year financial accounts and statements. And this code, like it does in every other sense of what it does, has sections, and one of them is on effectiveness, and it has a main principle and supporting principles. It's worth just having a quick look at some of the main things that it says there about what boards could be doing. It talks about the board undertaking a formal and rigorous annual evaluation of its own performance, note the word annual, and that of its committees and of its individual directors. So it's talking about 3 different types of annual evaluation there. And it's also talking about looking at the balance of skills, the experience and independence and knowledge of the company, i.e. college, that board members have. It talks about looking at diversity, gender, how it works together as a unit, and other factors that it feels are relevant to making it an effective board. It talks about the chairman acting on the evaluation, so what the outcomes of the performance evaluation are. It talks about recognising your strengths, addressing your weaknesses, and possibly even going as far as looking at new members to come onto the board or seeking the resignation of other directors. So it's quite robust there. And it talks about individual evaluation of governors, which should include whether they contribute effectively and demonstrate commitment in terms of time. So that's the kind of thing that the UK Corporate Code is expecting us to do in terms of self-assessment. And as I say, at the end of each year, you'll be saying whether you're complying with that or explaining where you don't. But we have another code, and that's more recently introduced, and that's the English Colleges Foundation Code of Governance, which came out in November 2011. And it's just quite interesting to compare the two. This is all that it says. There's nothing else or extra or expanded. So it talks about a regular effectiveness assessment. It doesn't say annual, it says regular. And it should include consideration, and then there's a whole section, which I'm not going to dwell on, 3.1.1, about the performance of the college, and 2, about the reputation of the college. But when we get to 3.1.3, it talks about considering the performance of the chair, of other governors holding offices or undertaking defined roles within the governance structure. So it doesn't go as broad brush as talking about all governors. It talks about the governing body undertaking a formal self-evaluation of its effectiveness as frequently as it thinks it should do, but at least every 3 years. So again, it's not talking about annually. But it does talk about the chair ensuring performance and evaluation and effectiveness of all governors is assessed on an ongoing basis. So there's a different kind of slant in that code to the previous one, although there's some common threads. So that's the codes. But I've never been one for standing up and saying, well, we do something because we're told to do it, because I always think that's a fairly pointless exercise. There's far more to self-assessment than just doing something because you're told you're supposed to do it. And the kind of areas you're going to look at in a self-assessment as a board are likely to surround compliance, i.e., are you doing everything that you're supposed to be doing? But also getting beyond that compliance kind of tick box exercise, which you can sometimes turn into, and looking at, well, have you set a standard of expected outcomes for board effectiveness? You know, do you know what you are trying to achieve in terms of what you mean by being an effective board? And then being sure that you can judge yourselves against those expectations that you've set of yourself. And I've included behaviours there, and we'll talk about that more as we go along. But in terms of behaviours, I'm talking about collective behaviours, both as individual governors and also as a collective group, a corporate team. But quite critically, it's what you do with that information once you've done it, in terms of the outcome of self-assessment. We could all do self-assessment and navel-gaze incessantly, but the point of it is actually then finding out and learning about yourselves and doing something with the outcome. So it's whether you have some kind of action plan or what you do, and is it monitored through to completion. So in terms of self-assessing, and you always see this as a preamble to most of these kind of workshops, but it is true that it is one size doesn't fit all. What I will stand up and say about West Herts College and what Chris will say about St Helens College is this is what happens to have worked for us and has evolved over a period of time. And it's been appropriate to where we were on whatever journey we were on in terms of the development of our boards and our colleges. And each of you will come to your own view about what self-assessment should mean for you right here, right now. And it won't necessarily be the same as where we both are now in our individual self-assessments. But the kind of dependencies or the things that you'll be thinking about will be both what context your college is currently in. Is it an outstanding college? Is it a college in recovery? What are the things you know that need to be addressed? And within that, what context is your board in? Have you been judged to be outstanding? Have you had issues with governance? Do you have a lot of new members? Do you have long-standing members? And all of those considerations will affect the kind of areas you choose to focus your self-assessment methods on at any particular point in time. So that being said, let's talk about West Herts College and move into the West Herts College case study. This has definitely been an evolving framework. Anybody who knows the history of West Herts College will know back in 2003 it had one of the worst Ofsted inspections probably of that time, and it was put into recovery. And I joined the college just a couple of months later, and they hadn't been doing a self-assessment, so we had to start from scratch. One of the first areas we had to focus on was compliance, because they had been severely criticised in the inspection, both for governance performance in general, but also from the PFA audit about some things not even being done that were regulatory and should have been done. So our initial approach was to introduce a compliance-based self-assessment. In other words, are we doing all the things as a governing body they should be doing? And it was only when we'd been doing that kind of approach for 1 or 2 years that we had the assurance that everything was tickety-boo, everything was fine, and we could then move on to looking more at the effectiveness in terms of how it conducted board responsibilities that were beyond just pure compliance. And so there were a couple of years of using a self-assessment framework that focused in on things like that. Then we began to look at, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a couple of slides' time, how we worked together, or how the board worked together as a corporate team, getting more into the things I was talking about just now about behaviours of both individuals as a corporate group. And finally, where we are at the moment, as you'll see if you have a look at the strategy, is we're looking even more into detail about the contribution of governance, that $1 million question. If governors weren't there, what difference would it make to the college? And really trying to get under the skin of where governance adds value in the college. And that's taken as probably in 2-year chunks over an 8-year period. So our self-assessment strategy has looked different and has evolved and changed and been tweaked and moved on each year according to the context of where the college was and where the board was. And the kind of judgments we've used have changed as well. We started off, when we were doing the compliance self-assessments, using very much what I would say is a simple scoring system. In some cases, the answers were straight yes or no's. But then we started moving into a scoring system which tended to model the Ofsted inspection grades of 1 to 4 and started to introduce more comments, getting input from governors in terms of how they were basing their judgments and also what they thought might be an area for improvement. Our final evaluation, which we're using it particularly at the moment for the corporation, we've virtually abandoned scoring altogether. But what we are asking governors to do is to provide evidence to back up their judgments. And we did that for the first time last summer. So the question will be asked about the effectiveness of governance in any particular area. But then the direct question underneath is, what's your judgment on that? And how do you know? What's the evidence to support? And governors would be the first to turn around and say to you, it took longer to fill in, because it really had to, they said it made me think. I really had to think, well, I feel like such and such an area is good, but how do I know that? It's more than just a gut feeling. And they had to really think about what evidence was there to support their feeling about it's good or it's not so good and why. What was very noticeable about using that type of approach was the outcomes, because it gave a much stronger set of outcomes in terms of where we could take forward areas for improvement. It identified where we were strong, and it identified where we had areas where we needed to do some more work. So that actually has worked quite well, even though it's slightly more labour-intensive for governors. What we've also tried to do, and our governors are very keen in terms of never wasting their time or any resources, is not to duplicate anything that's already there. So we see as part of our self-assessment strategy the use of the FMCE. And even though we don't have to do it anymore, we are still going to complete that document and just let the audit committee have a look at it, because we think that's a useful area of assessment in a certain level of assurance in certain processes and procedures, and we're going to maintain it. Similarly, if you've had PFA audits in the college, and we had another inspection in 2010, I should have mentioned earlier we were graded as outstanding, so I'd like to think we've done something right along the way. But still there are areas that come out of those, and we look at those and we'll act on them when they happen. And of course, internal audit fieldwork reports. They go over certain areas each year, and we're not at all trying to replicate those. So we see all those very much as part of our self-assessment or assessment of governance in the college. And we don't replicate those in any way. And I think it's worth always just thinking to yourselves, how do we approach that? Are we asking governors questions which auditors are already looking at, or the FMCE, if we're still using it, is already challenging us on there, and we don't really need to waste time looking at those areas. But it goes back to outcomes, the importance of what you actually do with the self-assessment. First of all, the information is all gathered, and as clerks, I'm sure you'll recognise that you have quite a role to play in gathering that information and then presenting it to the boards in whichever way you choose to do it, whether it's a presentation, whether it's a report. You're pulling together different strands of self-assessment as they're undertaken. And they go to the board where they're discussed, and the outcomes are agreed and approved. They then feed in our college into an annual governance improvement plan. Very much as the kind of improvement plan you'd see in other strands of areas of provision in your college, where we identify we identify strengths, and we identify the areas of improvement and how we're going to deal with those, who's going to action it, by when, how we know when it's been achieved, that kind of an improvement plan. And it also inevitably impacts on the review of the business plan, and by that I mean the schedule of meetings and reports that go to the board. And quite often there'll be a comment coming out of self-assessment that there's a board, for example, we're not seeing enough information or getting involved enough in steering discussions on XYZ topic. And that will impact on the business plan immediately. We don't wait, we just do something about it there and then. So that improvement plan, the chair and I monitor it through to completion. We keep a close eye on it in our meetings together. But it also feeds into the college's self-assessment report. We are very much part of the whole SAR, the self-assessment report of the college. It's a culture, really, in terms of thinking we expect the college to have a very robust self-assessment, and we think as governors we should be doing this, that the governors should be doing the same. So the outcomes of the self-assessment feed directly into that self-assessment report. Governance has its own section under the leadership and management heading of the SAR. And then that in turn results in a quality improvement plan for governance, which is one of the underpinning quality improvement plans in the college that cover all of the areas that feed into the top level QIP. And that's monitored as well. And as a director of governance in the college, like the other directors and other college managers, I meet once or twice a term with the quality team. I'm held to account by them for how you're getting on with the progress on the improvements that you've identified. So not only the chair and I monitoring it to completion, but it's an integral part of the college's quality improvement plan as well. As I said, it also feeds into anything we want to do in terms of changing the schedule of papers, quality of papers, meeting reports, and so on and so forth. Another area of self-assessment, as far as we're concerned, is the work of the search committee. Because, in our case, we call it Search and Governance Committee, because they do a fundamental role in terms of the improvement and the effectiveness of the governors, in terms of making sure we've got the right people on the bus, and that we are making sure that those skills match where we are at any point in time in the development of the college. So we obviously have a skills audit. I say obviously, we have a skills audit where the board skills as a standing item are regularly reviewed and assessed. And that skills audit has changed over the years as well. From the position of recovery in 2004, where we had a multi-million deficit, the skills we needed on the board were quite strong on the financial side. As we moved on and things improved, we didn't need so many financial people, but we needed different skills. And as employability skills and employment engagement is now coming through, we're looking for different skills again. And the skills audit is not a static document. It's changed and evolved in the same way that self-assessment has changed and evolved. Because we know there's different skills on the board now that we needed 2004, 2008, 2010. We're also looking at succession planning. And we've actually changed in the last 2 years, just under 2 years, every single role and responsibility and area of role and responsibility on our board has changed, from chair, vice chair, all the chairs of the committee and our designated safeguarding governors. Every single one of those has been turned over, and that wouldn't have been possible, and it's been done effectively. Wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't been planning for succession and, again, thinking about the skills of the people on the board. And without thinking about that, then governance, I think, is at risk. Training needs come out of often the individual assessments, which I'll talk about in a moment, and come out through self-assessment, and we act on those and often have a training plan for the year. And all induction and training is actually evaluated right the way through to the end, and that also goes through the search committee. So they've got a fundamental role as part of our self-assessment strategy. Now, this is not a list. This is not a thou must do all these things. I would never suggest that for 1 minute. What I'm showing you here is a list of the kind of things that we have used at any given point in time. Skills audit I've already talked about. We do that. That happens all the time. It's just a standing thing that we keep looking at and reviewing. But we are trying always to make sure that it reflects the college's strategic aims. So it would be inevitable, for example, if the college's strategic plan changed, that we go straight back to the skills audit and say, right, does that need to change? We've got the annual review of the effectiveness of the cycle of the reports. That's part of the self-assessment. Are we getting the right information to the governors in a timely fashion during the year to enable them to do their job? And if we aren't, we do something about it. The papers themselves, for me, papers make or break governance. I think it's just a fundamental thing we've got to get right. And if there's ever a sense, and we did have this back in the day, particularly around, I would say, when we changed our model of governance to a more strategic model of governance, we did a lot of work on the effectiveness of papers, and we used a very simple form just to give to the governors to give feedback on the quality of papers, that feedback then went back to the authors. And it enabled tremendously improvement to the quality of the papers and the information that the governing body received. But it's there, and if we ever felt there was an issue again, we wouldn't hesitate to go back and do that again. And the same would apply to the effectiveness of meetings. Again, when we changed our model of governance, we wanted to feel that, were the meetings doing what governors needed them to do? And every so often, periodically, throughout 1 year, we actually evaluated the quality of the meetings themselves. And again, if we have identified an issue, we've got that tool in the box that we could use. We do currently do an annual corporation effectiveness review. That's the one I was talking to you about a moment ago when I said that's the one where we go very much for the evidence-based approach. It's looking far more at the board, its behaviours and its effectiveness and the value that it adds. The chair conducts annual performance reviews, appraisals, call them what you will. At the end of the day, they're a conversation between the chair and the governor about how well things are going. It helps to identify succession aspirations and things like that. Helps to have the chair to have a one-to-one conversation with the governor that often is not easy to do. And they also identify training needs and all sorts of succession areas as well that we can act upon. The chair's performance is now evaluated annually, and it's conducted through the vice chair, and she and I just work together to pull the whole thing together. And it's a very open and transparent process and becomes part of the report that finally goes to the board at the end of the year. Committees, we take a simpler approach. We simply transfer their terms of reference into a questionnaire. And that enables you to do two things in one go. Number one, how effective are you at doing what you've been charged to do by the board? And B, are your terms of reference actually in need of a review? So it combines a self-assessment evaluation with a terms of reference review. And that's the approach we've virtually taken ever since we started, and that's worked really well. And last but not least, I wouldn't forget the annual clerk's performance review. As a clerk, my performance is reviewed once a year. I have targets set, which are very much in line with the outcomes of the self-assessment. So there's areas that have been identified for improvement. Odds are there's going to be a target for me to do something about it. I have a mid-year appraisal review, and I'm held to account at the end of the year for how well I've done in terms of helping support the board to achieve certain things. And it's absolutely intrinsically linked to the outcomes of self-assessment. And as I said before, all those things then feed into a governance improvement plan. What we did do a few years ago, we were very aware that this was, that you could turn this into an exercise of incessant navel-gazing and looking inwards at yourselves. And I know personally, I never see myself as others see me, and I think a board is exactly the same. And odds are, if there was a problem, you might not spot it. Or you might not have identified a criteria that you could be judged against because you just hadn't thought of it. And so we wanted to get an external view of ourselves, somebody completely independent, not Ofsted, just somebody completely independent, somebody who actually came to a meeting, which Ofsted never do. And we looked around, and I won't tell you the names of the people we talked to, but they were wanting to charge us up to £18,000 for the privilege of doing it, and we thought, thank you, but no thank you. So we approached ELSIS and said, look, this is what we're looking to do, and we can't find somebody who can deliver it in a sensible financial manner. And ELSIS very kindly agreed that they would work with us, and to cut a very long story short, we ended up piloting something called the Learning Board, which has now been rolled out nationally. And it worked extremely well for us. I'm not going to talk to you more about that because Chris is going to go into it in more detail later. But that's what we did with that. And that was a wonderful opportunity for having people coming in and looking at you. And we want to do something similar again. So this year, we've approached another outstanding college in a similar situation to ourselves, not identical, reasonably local but not too local for all the reasons you can probably imagine, who've also been a judgment of outstanding on governance. And we've asked them if they'd like to join us in a peer review, and they've very kindly said yes. So we're going to be working with Richmond Adult Community College. And just 4 people, the chair, vice chair, principal and myself, are going to go and observe one of their meetings. We'll get all the papers for their meeting, and they'll do the same to us, and we'll feed back to each other. The clerk and I, Paul Coveney and I, have devised a very simple, we want it to be unbureaucratic form. Those doing the observations will be able to complete, and then we'll share our findings together and see where that leads us and see how effective that is. And if it works, then we may well do it again. Interestingly, our staff governors are already asking, can they do it? And they'd like to do a reciprocal swap with staff governors, so I think we may have started something here, but we'll see how well it goes. But we think that external view is actually really quite useful. And I'd like to just finish sort of looking at this slide, because this is not us saying this. This was Ofsted's view of common features of outstanding governance. And it's something that's not a bad kind of little set of criteria. When you think about that word ongoing review, the chair is required to do an ongoing review of the effectiveness of governance. If you were to have some of these things in the back of your mind in terms of thinking, are we effective? Are we, it's not just a once-a-year process. I think a good board will always be thinking, could we do better, challenging itself to do better. And this is quite a good, I think, tick list of where these were the features that Ofsted saw on outstanding boards, and saying, okay, well, how do we match up to some of those? It'd be quite interesting to see. So that's it from me in terms of West Herts. I'd like to pass over to Chris Jones now, and she'll be telling you a little bit about what happens at St Helens College.
Thank you very much. I've never actually spoken into a microphone before, so I hope you're all kind to me today. Why am I actually here today? This time last year I attended the Governors' Conference and attended a similar workshop, although it was smaller in size, on self-assessment. And I think we all try to go to these workshops to gain a bit of information. And I was really disappointed at the beginning when they said, well, we're not here to tell you how to do it, because that's what I was hoping to find out, and I'm sure that's what a lot of you are here for today. But what I did pick up from another clerk from one of the Northwest sixth form colleges, and also from the ELSIS people who were actually delivering the workshop. And I'd like to say I'm not here to promote the Learning Board at all. Joe Matthews, who's the lead consultant, or was for us, asked me to actually emphasise that. But I picked it up as a good external way of doing self-assessment from the very little they told us at the time. So I picked up one of the leaflets and I took it back to my college, and usually if I take these things to Search and Governance Committee, sometimes if there's a cost involved, no, as Sheila said, too expensive. However, we were very fortunate, because we're a grade 3 college, to be offered a package of support from ELSIS, a suite of different support arrangements, and one of those that was offered to us was the Learning Board. So I persuaded, well, I hope I did do a good persuasive job on our board to actually participate, and that's what we did. But what I'd like to tell you a bit about before I go on to that is what we actually did up to then. Like yourselves, like most colleges, we undertake an annual self-assessment of governance. I try and approach it from a triangular methodology. We have a collective questionnaire, as most people do, and I actually worked on that with Julia. Julia from Lancaster actually shared her questionnaire with us, because for the last 17 years we've had various questionnaires, to be honest. We've been involved in peer review with Blackpool and the Fylde College on self-assessment, and that was quite a good exercise back about 10 years ago, to be truthful. And funnily enough, it's the former Reg Chapman, who was the principal of Blackpool College, and I know a lot of you would have known Reg, who actually led that process, and the clerk, John Burgess, at the time. They came to our board and looked at our self-assessment models, and we did the same with them. And that was well before the days of things like the Learning Board. What the clerk taught me was, on a questionnaire, why have you put that in? Don't you have to do that anyway? And he told me to take it out. As Sheila said, try not to repeat what you already do, and to try and get away from the compliance element of a questionnaire, and more to trying to get to the heart of what the corporation actually does. And that's where I think the Learning Board can actually help you. So we do a collective questionnaire based on Ofsted judgments. We do an individual questionnaire to individual governors, which again many of you might do, and I ask them to score themselves on how they contribute to the work of the board. Some governors don't like doing that actually, because they say, well, how can I score myself? But what I'll do is I have one-to-one meetings with each governor in the summer. And I picked that up as good practice from another clerk some years ago. And to be honest, although it's time-consuming, they are the most valuable meetings that I have with, and I'm sure some of you might already do this if you are clerks, with governors, because I'll go through their self-assessment questionnaire with them at that time and find out a little bit more behind what they're actually saying, get more comments from them. Is there any training and development that they identify themselves that they might not feel comfortable in saying in a board environment? And actually that does happen. They'll say, oh gosh, I've seen management accounts for years now, but I don't quite understand this. And I'll get a discreet meeting with the relevant head back in the college with them to try and work with them on sorting out those issues. So I always find those one-to-one meetings with governors invaluable. We undertake an information analysis periodically, as Sheila's already mentioned, at West Herts. And I was trying to pick out things here that Sheila doesn't do, but to be truthful, there is repetition between colleges. We are not as fortunate as Sheila. We haven't gone down the e-governance route as much as they have. I don't know if you've heard of West Herts' reputation in that regard, but we still very much do paper-based systems. But I've just done an information questionnaire to governors to ask them more about e-governance, because I do want to shift to that sort of method. We review each committee's terms of reference, but I've just picked up good practice from what Sheila said on the way they do it. We don't actually do that, so that's something that I will introduce this year. The clerk's performance review is an important aspect. I am appraised by the chair each year with a review 6 months into the year. I'm set very challenging targets, smart targets, and I'm told to meet them. So that's what I try to do. The skills audit is a very important aspect of governance, as Sheila said, and our Search and Governance Committee, for me, is an invaluable committee, and we always undertake the skills audit through the work of the Search and Governance Committee, as we do in producing the annual cycle of business. Our Search and Governance Committee, I can actually take any good practice that's identified, and that might be the case again in other colleges in the sector, particularly from the North West group of clerks, which are a fantastic support to me. I can take any good practice to that committee as an exemplar of good practice, and they'll either reject it or they won't, or they take it on board. They're very embracing our corporation of any new practice at all in governance, and that's quite pleasing for me. The Learning Board self-assessment of governance I'll talk about in a second. Mind mapping exercises. I've sort of thought of this idea this year that a lot of the stuff that I produce, particularly slides, for instance, are a bit boring, not very visual. And I thought to myself, well, I was asked by the principal to have a look at all the changes we've done since the last inspection, because we're waiting for the call any day, and it's bound to happen soon. So rather than she did a list of the things that she thought we'd change, because we have a new principal from last year. So I've put that into a mind map, and I meant to bring it with me actually to just show you. And it looks a lot better than giving inspectors a list, for instance. And we've actually RAG rated that, which I'm sure many of you do. And we can show the journey throughout the year of how we're progressing those issues. The annual clerk's report, that was actually picked up by LSIS when they did their exercise with us as good practice as part of self-assessment. And to be truthful, I never thought of it as a self-assessment document. It's a report that I do, again, quite a boring paper-based system, that I do every year for the board, and it's sort of a year in the life of, if you like. I summarise all the decisions that the board has made throughout the year, which sounds like a big job, but it actually isn't, because I do that for every meeting anyway, summarise the decisions of that, or the key outcomes, as we now call them, of that meeting. So I literally cut and paste all those into a document for the board for ease of reference. I put the quality improvement plan in here from the previous year's self-assessment, and that actually goes through our Search and Governance Committee very regularly and is monitored through that route on behalf of the board. But I put it in here as a progress end-of-year report for them. I actually put all the attendance statistics in here, for name and shame if you like, which governors actually like. They actually like to see what they've attended and what they haven't done. I summarise all the governor development throughout the year that they've taken part in, and I try and do evaluations in here as well, and costs, etc. So that they picked that up, which I was surprised at really, because at the last information analysis point, I asked governors, did they actually want me to drop this report? Because I've done it for so many years, I found it might be a little... But what I am going to do is try and make it more visual and do a bit more mind mapping in this to make it not as just a read-only document. So that's that. As with West Herts, all these things feed into a governance improvement plan. The college is under leadership and management, and obviously the quality improvement plan. In the LSIS report, I don't know if any of you have seen this report that Reg Chapman, again, who fortunately passed away recently. Reg was one of the consultants who worked with us on the learning board, and it was very sad that when we heard the news that he'd actually passed away. He actually produced this report, Challenges for FE College Governance and Priorities for Development. And he does have quite a good section in here about one of the challenges of governance is actually an underdeveloped board self-evaluation. And he actually asks who challenges the challengers, as that can be quite a delicate exercise. And he says that more challenge and support's needed for colleges to conduct a robust self-evaluation. And we need to have effective benchmarking data and tools supported by a clearer statement of principles of good strategic governance and assisted by external facilitation or critical friends. That's where I suppose the learning boards come into it for us this year. As I say, I was really pleased that governors decided to go with the board concept because it actually took self-assessment away from the clerk for a year. And allowed them to come in, LSIS, and observe our board. What they actually do is, the board development framework identifies 5 discrete areas of activity beyond compliance, which underpins the concept of the learning board, and there they are listed there. What they do is they develop a questionnaire for you, and you've got input into that. They do a model that they send to you, and I added a couple of questions about clerking, for instance, that I felt were missing, and we changed the emphasis of a few things because it's your questionnaire. They very much emphasise that. It's not the questionnaire that they're imposing on you. You've got an input into that. And they conduct 1.5 hour interviews with every governor. At first you think, oh my goodness, that's dreadful. How are they going to do that? Well, they'll do it by telephone or they'll do it face to face. Most of ours were by telephone. One of our governors was actually on holiday in London, and he got the call to have this one, which was very kind of him, talk about volunteers going that extra mile. And they go through the questionnaire with you, and it's not a tick box questionnaire. It's very much, how do you feel about? What's your view upon, obviously. They know about the college, they have the background, they take our last Ofsted report, and they'll in the report, they'll tell you that you've already travelled a journey. They'll actually put where they think you're positioned in their final report against that Ofsted report. So you do get a very comprehensive report at the end of it. As well as the interviews, which I think was quite good, as they came in and they actually attended 2 of our full board meetings, and there was 2 consultants. I felt like I was being inspected, actually, one at either side of the table. But they did sit back. They weren't participative in any way. And they attended our Search and Governance Committee, which I was really pleased about because I think that's a really active committee, and one of our resources committees. And you get a report back after each one of those observations. What they're observing really is the dynamics, I think, of the board, how challenge is done, undertaken, because they'll give you a section about that, how they feel conflict is dealt with. Because I was saying to Sheila earlier, when they asked me, because I participated as clerk, and so did the principal in the questionnaires, they asked me about conflict, and your first instinct is to say, oh no, we don't have any. No, there's none of that, which is what you tend to say. But to be honest, when you read this report of Reg, this ELSIS report that Reg did, that's obviously a good thing. And he says conflict is something that should be in a board, so I'd actually answered it wrong, I think. Anyway, that was that. So that's what was actually involved in the process. It took about 3 months in length. We started in June or July, and they attended the first board meeting in July, and then they went through to September, and we got our final report in about October, November time. I mean, what were the 3 most valuable outcomes from taking part in the Learning Board process? Well, as you can see on the slides, I think it assisted, well, this is what the actual board said themselves. It assisted the corporation to reflect on their processes. It assisted them in a realignment process because there was some overlap in some of the committees that we already knew about, to be honest, but I think the Learning Board picked that out as an actual action point. And it assisted them in challenging some of the preconceptions and set ideas that they felt they had. I mean, if I can just read out for you, if I can find it, what worked well for governors. They said, our governors actually said, because we had a full meeting about this, and again, that's what was really pleasing, because we've got so much work to do to try and get to that outstanding status that Sheila's fortunately achieved. We obviously have a lot of business as a board, but the board actually gave time to self-assessment, really, I think, this time, for the first time in a while. I mean, they do complete the questionnaires, they're very good at that. I compile a report, I take it through the board, and we identify weaknesses, don't get me wrong, and we have an action plan every year. Without an action plan, how can you go forward? But I think for the first time they sat down, they had a full meeting, a separate non-scheduled meeting about this report and thoroughly went through it, which is what I found quite rewarding, really. And they said that it gave the governors a forum to, they felt that the interviews gave governors a forum to express their feelings separately as part of these interviews. They felt that the process assisted the board in taking stock and making specific time to the operation of the corporation. And governors liked the observation processes, which I was surprised about really, but they felt that this provided a forum for the consultants to check the views of governors' statements were required. So I thought that was quite a good evaluation really. To be honest, there wasn't very much negative about it thinking back. I suppose when you get your report, I mean, again, it sounds as if I'm promoting this. This is promoting external self-assessment rather than, I suppose, the Learning Board per se. But we asked them to divide where you'd get one comment from one governor rather than a collective view. We asked them to try and do that in the report, and they actually did that for us, which was really good. Because you don't want to go off on a certain tangent if it's just one governor's, well, you might do. It depends what the comment is, really, and how serious it is. But that's how we got round that. I mean, for me as clerk, as I said there, I think it demonstrates a process of continuous improvement and a willingness of governance to be viewed externally. I mean, we have taken part in external self-assessment in the past. I don't know if many of you remember governance health checks, for instance, were around in the former funding council days. Those who've been clerks for a number of years might remember that. And as I say, we have done peer review with other colleges, which I know is an area that Sheila's getting involved with at the moment, and that might be something that we should be looking at. But again, I think the final thing for me is it took governors beyond the tick box of traditional annual self-assessment linked to compliance, because it wasn't just a tick box exercise. And I don't think there were any surprises, because I think if you do self-assessment well anywhere, you shouldn't have any surprises. But I think it emphasised a couple of things. For instance, I've managed to get the board to now agree terms of office for new governors, which, to be truthful, we've always not agreed with, because we've got quite a lot of long-standing governors, and we didn't want to actually ask anybody to leave. So for a number of years, though, because I know it's good practice, I've actually wanted to introduce that, and I know many of you've got that anyway, but it took me a while to get that through, and not me, for the board to agree to that. And that's what they actually did this year, which is quite pleasing. And in a nutshell, I think that's what the Learning Board's about. So I'll hand over back to Sheila. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So, very quickly in summary, I love these sessions because even when you're doing something like this, I've been scribbling away notes from Chris's one, and I'm really trying to say is this isn't rocket science. Self-assessment isn't the outcome. Self-assessment is just a tool in the box. And like Chris, she's already sort of alluded to the fact that she picked up a lot of bits and pieces from other colleagues. And if anybody, some of these clerks in the room, look at the self-assessment strategy that's up on the case study, they're going to probably spot questions that came from their self-assessments, because we do share as clerks and lots of bits and pieces come together. And when you're looking for something and you can't find what you're looking for, the first port of call is always to look for another college and see how they've done it and pick and choose and tweak it to suit yourselves. So what we're trying to identify is a whole series of tools in a box that you can choose from as and when you require it, and you'll need different tools for different types of occasions in whatever stage your board is in. But I think it's about, I hope we've possibly demonstrated, that it's actually about having a culture of self-assessment. And if I could sum it up as I did before, I think as a board, you would expect your colleges to be doing incredibly robust, challenging self-assessment. And I don't see any reason why as a governing body shouldn't be doing exactly the same, in terms of always recognising there's always going to be something that you can improve on. So we're very happy, and I'm glad to say we have got some time for questions at the end, and we'd love to hear in terms of either questions you've got from things that we've spoken about, or if there are other areas of self-assessment or methods in the room that people are using and finding really working effectively for them. Now's your chance to say it and share it with all the rest of us here. So we're happy to take questions. Lovely, thank you. Kai, I'm going to come sit down.
No, our SAR goes to our Search and Governance Committee, and they are the validating panel. So it's governors validating governors. No, we haven't done that. No, is that something that you do actually, John? Is it right? Okay. So who sits on the panel, if you don't mind me? Sorry? Who sits on the panel?
It could be a cross section of college managers and governors, any governors that are available. So any cross college SAR or curriculum SAR. Yeah. Internally, yeah. Great. So, if you're doing that, why not do it to of course, yeah. Subject them to I think that the argument is it subjects them to the same rigor that the rest of the college is subject to. So that when they do see the SAR assessments, there's comfort and know what the process is inside rather than outside. Yeah. So that's just one. The other bit, and this is one I always wrestle with, it is the assessment of governance by governors is always very much subjective. Of course, yeah. Very much my perception of it, because there isn't one like the rest of the SAR process. Yeah. There aren't national benchmarks, there aren't success rates, there aren't things that we can measure performance against. There have improvement plans for achieving an end, which begs the last question, which is, how do you know what self-assessment processes happen on the quality of the vision that the college turns down? Because there aren't those measures, external measures to assess against. So it's just, and that, I reckon if anybody can crack that. I think,
if we could put it up on a slide, it would be fantastic, wouldn't it? I know.
I think it is about knowing.
I know, John, yeah.
And we go through, even though it's a different process, it's still a process. I'm still push on the outcome side of it. And,
yes.
Okay, we may have better governance. How do we know we can't measure that in terms of the impact on the quality of what we turn out?
I know. Yeah.
I think one of the things, the only thing I found that really evidenced it for me, and it happened last year, I think best for the first time, was using that corporation self-assessment report that asked you to pick out the evidence. because that's where governors really had to think about, well, what impact, what difference have we made? And although the reports are anonymised to all the other governors, inevitably as clerk, when one comes in, you know where it's come from. And for me, the principals one produced the biggest evidence of where the value is added, because she could articulate far better than any of our governors could what difference the governors have made. Yeah. She and the directors knew. You know, they turned around and said, for example, the strategic plan that had just been created, the governors had been involved in every step of the way, from before a piece of paper was, word was put to paper. They had been involved in the whole process as it developed. And she turned around and said it never would have had the entrepreneurial strand, for example, that ended up in that strategic plan if it hadn't been for the governors. She picked that out. Mm-hmm. I think governors almost sometimes it's so in your DNA to be challenging, constructive, and help the colleges, that sometimes I think when you do something almost naturally, you can't articulate it. And I think they couldn't articulate it as well as the principal could. I think if you've got a sense of where you want to be as a board, and if you know what you think effective governance will look like in your college, and I think if you know what it is you're trying to achieve in your college, then you can start to think, right, how are we going to have impact, and then you can analyse where you've had it. But it is a hard nut to crack.
It is.
I don't think
it's a very hard, it's a very hard thing to get that questionnaire right that you're going to send out to governors, because that's fundamental, really. Because I don't know where I'm going to go next year now with self-assessment, to be truthful.
It will change for us next year because of teaching and learning focus. I think we will inevitably look at it again with a critical eye and say, right, with the new emphasis on teaching and learning, although we think it's core business as far as we're concerned in our business plan, are we asking all the right questions? And that's a hard one, to crack, but I think it's something you just carry on working and pinching ideas from other people. Sorry, Claire.
One thing that we did do this year, which is something that Chris said was in her class, and I think it's something that we really looking forward to. We took the decisions that the board had taken all year, and we looked at the impact that those decisions had had on quality of teaching, on the student experience, and on the student outcomes. And it really focuses on that. It's that articulation from your perspective, Sheila. If you actually think hard enough, you can align it.
You can, yeah. It's that thinking hard enough, isn't it? I know.
As long as I thought, that's a task that was given to me by our principal. He said, take the top 10 decisions, but actually we did it for all of them. And it not only did it show, actually demonstrated value that the board was giving, it made the board really think hard about their role and what they do in boardrooms. And it made them appreciate the role as well. So I think that was a really useful exercise.
Fantastic
That's just
idea.
so good, yeah.
We're not going to have a benchmark, but it did help us look outside.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that's a
really
good
set
idea.
of questions in terms of just to say, okay, evidence against the impact on the college, the impact on the learners, and the impact on the community.
And you could put it in a mind map.
And then have a mind map.
Have a
I'm going to get into mind maps
visual.
when I go back. I can tell you, no more boring documents from me. I'm going to have mind maps all over the place.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions that people have got or things that they would like to raise? Hi, yes.
As Mr. Garden talked about benchmarking, one thing we considered is actually doing a similar self-evaluation as other colleges and benchmarking against ourselves. I know it doesn't relate to the impact to the students or the college itself, but hopefully it will give us a better understanding of where we sit with similar colleges and just benchmark each other.
Yes. We don't have that kind of data out there at the moment, do we? I don't know how much I'm hearing about and being a tiny bit involved in the effective board that ELSIS are doing, and I know there's a workshop on that this afternoon. But it'd be interesting to see if that's going to lead to something like that, because otherwise you do work in this whole splendid isolation, don't you? And certainly from just going, I've been on both sides of the table in terms of the learning board from when we started it. I've since been an assessor and gone into colleges and actually sort of done it and actually been one of the assessors going in. And it's incredible, just as an outside observer, when you go in and watch a board meeting and process, or you look at their papers or whatever, just the things you pick up that you can identify to them that you haven't seen. One of the simple things that we had when they came to see us was the lack of socialising between our governors. Now, there was a reason for that to a certain extent, because they happened to come and observe in our college the first 2 meetings when we'd started e-governance. So everyone was dead keen to come in, grab their laptop, sit down, log on, etc., etc. But the 2 observers said nobody spoke to each other, they didn't talk to each other. But we did actually then reflect on it and think, actually, no, it's very businesslike. And we just simply introduced a break halfway through, 10, 15-minute break into our board meetings to enable people to talk. And there was a noticeable then difference in terms of how governors engaged. And it was a simple thing, which we hadn't spotted, or I don't think we ever would have thought of.
One of the practical things that they spotted when they observed us was that we have a governor development session before each board meeting, as I know a lot of people do, a lot of boards do. But we didn't have a natural break, a simple thing, like you say, between the 2. So governors were going straight from a long session on governor development straight into the agenda without even having 10 minutes to gather their thoughts, reflect on what they've just heard. So they said, well, don't you think you should have a distinct break? So we're doing that for the first time at the next board meeting next week to give that, because your thought processes are different for development as they are to... And it's just a little simple thing, like you say, that you're so anxious to get governors through everything as quickly as possible, really, because you know their time's precious, with all respect, that you don't think of this simple thing sometimes.
No, it just gives you an opportunity to sit back and draw a breath and look at something.
It does.
Nils, did you have a question or comment?
To see the difference between West Herts and St Helens, that West Herts was the chair doing performance evaluation of governors.
We've actually taken the proposal that the chair they're offered. It is offered to every governor, but nobody actually has taken up that offer at the moment. They speak to the chair anyway. They often ring each other up. I know that, but no, we have taken. And one of the recommendations from the learning board is that maybe a formal appraisal process would be beneficial, but it was a one governor comment we found out at the end of the day. So I'll try and find out who that governor is when I do the one-to-ones and make sure they have that appraisal, because if they feel they want an appraisal, it's certainly there for them, but we don't systematically do that.
So one-to-one is not considered an appraisal?
No, it's a meeting really. I mean, we meet, informally really. But they know what, I mean, I do a formal report from it, I anonymise it if you like, and I take the comments back through search and governance, because I have a sort of set agenda when I do talk to them, set things in my mind that I want to cover, and governors are aware of that and quite happy to do it actually.
I'd be quite curious to see what the outcomes are that Chris has from doing it as the clerk to the outcomes
it would
that
be
our
interesting.
chair identifies.
Yes.
Because I haven't heard until the same as you today in terms of Chris's approach to it. And the outcomes that I get the sense that Chris is getting from her meetings are almost identical to the outcomes that come from our college where the chair conducts it. So it'd be interesting to see, were there any differences, and did it actually matter who had the conversation? And I'm not disparaging to the chair. Just
No,
the fact
not
is,
at all,
I think
no.
it's actually just the fact, and it is you can call it appraisal, you can call it performance review. It always sounds horribly formal, but it's a conversation between 2 people that doesn't tend to take place in the business or the busyness of the year. And I think the outcomes sound very similar.
What kind of time slots are you giving for these? About an hour?
About an hour.
About an hour each. Yeah.
Yeah. One more question? Yes.
Well, a quick one. You mentioned about self-assessment, getting the right numbers on the bus. We've got issues about getting them in the right seats on the bus and committees, and if you work strictly to the guidelines that 2 terms of 4 years, which we do, you're turning governors over regularly. And one of the ideas was, a new governor can go and sit on each committee for the first 12 months of each. Then you don't get the level of expertise.
No,
And Ofsted come in and ask to get Quality and Standards Committee in front of them.
that's
So
right.
you're reluctant to keep rolling people over on that committee because
You want consistency.
experience to speak off the cuff.
Of course you do.
And you talked about changing your chairman. I don't know how you manage that then.
Well, certainly the one-to-one interviews, conversations, call them what you will, between the chair and the individual members. One of the conversations, topics, is always about succession. Are there any roles or responsibilities on the board that you could see yourself doing in the future? And that then is exactly the same way that Chris does. A report comes to the Search and Governance Committee, And whilst the rest of the report is anonymised, and if anyone has turned around and said, yeah, one day I'd like to be chair of audit, or one day, I think I might stepping up to vice chair, or one day I'd like to be chair, we know about that. We get a sense of it. And then if someone's saying, well, I'm thinking about it, but I'm not too sure about how I'd cope with this, or I've never managed a meeting of quite that size, well, then you can start to look at training, you can look at exposure, you can look at, the chair, in our case, the chair would deliberately step out of a certain part of the meeting and let the vice chair take over when we were building out the person who had been identified as a potential governor. It's not preempting the issue, because clearly there's still a proper diplomatic process to go through. But I think also it goes right back to when you're actually appointing people. When we are, through search and governance, we've developed a recruitment set of questions and a selection criteria which match them, that kind of to start getting into, for judgments to be made against potential candidates. So when we're considering people who come forward for governance, we are considering whether they have the skills and attributes that could make them effective board members, but we've also got one eye now on the committees and the gaps on the committees. And when whoever's doing the interviews are considering that applicant, they have in front of them, they know the potential committee vacancies or role and responsibility vacancies that might be coming up. That's something that search and governance look at all the time. But right at the top of the form where they fill in the selection criteria, it will say, committee vacant. If there is a committee vacancy, it will be headlined up. So they've got a particular eye on that. So I think there it's also making sure you're asking the right questions, but being aware of what's around the corner so that you don't have a nasty surprise. I mean, there's always inevitably a human factor that comes into it.
Yeah.
Should identify that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is very much
Definitely.
so. Yes. We've
Definitely.
got 3 governors currently who are aspiring chairs, which is fantastic to know.
Brilliant.
Which I might never have known, to be honest, had I not had the
that
one-to-ones.
conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you all ever so much. Our time has come to the end. I'm sorry we're slightly losing to your approach time, but thank you. If there's any questions you'd like to ask either of us individually, you're more than welcome, or if you'd like to get in touch with us.